Welcome to Journeys with the No Schedule Man, exploring authentic stories of personal growth and lessons learned from people living true to themselves with creativity, passion, and purpose. For all past episodes, subscribe on iTunes or visit noscheduleman.com. And please connect, share, and contribute with a comment, rating, or review. And now, here's your host, the No Schedule Man, Kevin Bulmer.
I've been known to struggle with reality, not that it is any real mystery.
The question is, can you build a business worth multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, and even a multi-billion-dollar business, by putting people first and doing the right thing? The answer must be yes, because that's what Jim Estill does. Welcome, I'm Kevin Bulmer. This is Journeys with the No Schedule Man, exploring conversations on personal and professional growth, authentically sharing in an effort to empower each other as we all go up the mountain together. Wherever you may be on your path, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you'll find this helpful. You can find all past episodes of this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, and at noschedulemanpodcast.com. If you like it, I hope you'll subscribe and stay the course with us. And please do share it with someone else and invite them to come along. I've recently been rereading Bob Proctor's book, You Were Born Rich. In it, he reminds us to, quote, love people and use money. Now, I certainly have worked for and worked with many organizations whose actions would suggest the reverse of that notion. But not today's guest, not Jim Estill. Jim is the CEO and president of Danby, an appliance company based in Guelph, Ontario, not too far from Toronto. Jim recently sponsored more than 50 families of Syrian refugees to get resettled in the Guelph area. He was named to the Order of Ontario here in Canada. That's the province's highest honor. But that's not why Jim did that. He did it because he felt it was the right thing to do. And he actually feels guilty that he's not able to help everyone. And while we did discuss the decision and the process to facilitate assisting those families, I was really interested in Jim's journey overall and what led him to be in the position that he's in today. So we did spend some time discussing that, but we also did touch on the Syrian refugee situation. But the more fundamental, day-to-day, compassionate culture, encouraged and led by Jim, it's immediately apparent when you walk into the Danby corporate offices. That's where we did this interview. When you've been in and out of as many businesses as I have, you can just pick up on these things. It's in the way the rest of the staff refer to each other, and especially in their way that they refer to their leader. It's in their body language. It's reflected in the tone of their voice and even the general energy in the building. It seems really clear to me that Jim Estill puts people first. While he's got many terrific accomplishments and accolades to share from the course of his career, he's the only person that I've ever come across who lists himself as a humanitarian on his LinkedIn profile. From creating and running a painting business while he was in high school, to then starting a company while in university that was eventually sold and then scaled up to $2 billion in revenue under his leadership, to serving on the board of RIM. They're the makers of the famous BlackBerry, which did rule that smartphone space for a while. He was on that board for 13 years. To his current role at Danby Appliances and everything in between. It's been quite a professional journey for Jim so far. But through all of that, it's Jim's character and compassion that jumps out first and seems to be the consistent thread through it all. I think it's a really important story to hear and to share, and I'm really glad and honored that I got the opportunity to do both of those things and to spend this time with Jim. If you listen all the way through this conversation, notice that at no time do you hear Jim talk about things like market conditions or economic fluctuations or competitors or really anything that's beyond his own scope of influence. What he talks about is responsibility, asking himself who he needs to be in order for the entire company to get better, how he needs to grow, and what he needs to, well, in some cases, give up. Some of the key things I took away from my time with Jim Estill include, number one, 20 keys to set Jim free. This was a great story. He tells a really important tale of the time in his career when he was micromanaging to the point of exhaustion. He said he was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, and the solution for that was to get and then give 20 keys, one for each of his staff. It's a really important story for anybody looking to learn how to delegate. And listen for that. The 20 key story. I needed to hear that. I can tell you that. Number 2, doing the right thing scales. I'll just simply offer that the golden rule is a really deep well, very deep, empowering, and magnetic. It's a good place to go. Doing the right thing scales. Jim is proving that time and time again. Number 3, one of the best ways to be of more service and value to others is to continue to grow and work on yourself. Jim's a shining example of the value that can be brought to other people by taking on the task of improving yourself. He gives many examples of how he's done that and why, and how that's benefited his life and career, and ultimately has helped empower him to be able to go and make a difference in the lives of others. If you've got any interest at all in building business with integrity, you're going to enjoy Jim's story. And perhaps more fundamentally, if you just like to hear about good people doing good in the world, not for any other reason, but because it's the right thing to do, you're really going to love this. Here's the conversation exploring the journey of Jim Estill on Journeys with the No Schedule Man. Jim, what would you consider to be your definition of a humanitarian?
A humanitarian is basically someone who helps people who are in humanitarian need. And we all kind of have our own definition for that. But right now, I believe the Syrian crisis is our biggest humanitarian crisis of our lifetime. So that's the one that I'm currently focused a bit on. But I'm a general humanitarian, so there's other areas as well that need help.
Well, let's explore the general humanitarian. I don't think that it's something necessarily, or I wouldn't guess that it's a switch that flips, that you see something happening in the world or at work or in your family that then maybe I suppose you could just decide this is who I'm going to be in that moment, as opposed to maybe a larger expression of who you are at your core. How do you remember, or what do you remember about just sort of becoming that way as a person?
I mean, I guess it all starts when you're young. Everybody is idealistic when they're young and wants to save the world and help the world. And the problem is many people lose that. And I'm not sure why, but I've been very fortunate, very blessed in life. And so I have made it my life purpose to help other people. Now, part of it is also I've done some self-discovery and discovered my purpose, which is to help as many people as possible achieve their greatest potential. And I do that through business, and naturally some of that translates to the humanitarian end of it.
Tell me more about that self-discovery. More specifically, to start, when did you first become consciously aware that that was a journey you'd embarked upon?
Well, it probably didn't happen until I was in my 30s or 40s. So it's as I was getting somewhat older, and I did a lot of self-discovery to try to figure out what makes me tick and who I am. I enjoy doing it, and so I developed my life purpose. And once I had that life purpose, I believe it makes me more powerful, allows me to work within my competitive advantage, allows me to polish what I'm good at to be even better at, and it's helped to also reduce stress, because we often end up doing things that aren't in our purpose because other people think they should do them. But when you understand who you are, it just reduces your stress.
You're talking about stuff that the 4 or 5 year ago edition of the guy sitting across from you would have no idea what you're talking about, but the current version of Kevin does. But and talking about them somewhat casually because you've been through that process, I'm thinking. But I'm guessing there are people that will be listening that are maybe thinking, okay, what does this mean? Self-discovery, discovering your purpose. Let me see if we can take it through it according to the process that you've been through. So first of all, let's go back to, I think you mentioned maybe in your 30s. What was going on, or maybe not going on, that precipitated you to feel like you needed to do a little bit more discovery and find out what that purpose was?
I mean, I had relatively good business success, but relatively high stress.
Okay.
And so I recognize, I'm always trying to polish my business system. So I was trying to polish how can I make my life less stressful and better. And so I started reading and listening to audiobooks and journaling and studying that. And that's where I came around to this self-discovery. And I also did it because I was in business, trying to be successful in business and trying to analyze how to be more successful in business. So it all started actually with a quest for business success.
Gotcha.
And then it went into personal success.
Well, because you were often running out of, if I've read it right, out of the trunk of your car in post-secondary school.
Yeah, well, I started my trunk of the car business when I was in university. So
Right.
it was when I was in university, and I grew that business to $350 million in sales and sold it, and then ran the business that bought mine from $800 million to $2 billion. And so I was on that path when I was in my 30s and 40s. So
what did the stress that you felt was on top of you enough for you to want to do something about it? How was that manifesting and showing itself back at that time?
Well, wouldn't have been to my 30s that I started to notice that my health wasn't as good, because you can always ride on past glories when you're in your 20s. And so then I decided, gee, I need a health plan. So I developed a health plan, and then it was all this polishing, which I can always do to try to get better and better and better. So that's what started me on the path. But largely it was having business success and not feeling very fulfilled. So I was just feeling, I just wasn't feeling as successful as everybody thought I was, if that makes sense.
If I can back you up a second, what do you mean by health plan?
Oh, well, when you're in your 20s, you naturally do very physical things. You get to your 30s, if you don't keep doing stuff, then all of a sudden you're not playing touch football and pick up hockey, and things can fall away. So one of my values is health, and that's part of self-care. So I'm a very health-focused person. So I have a complete plan of habits, and I call them health habits or success habits. Simplest, it all starts, I work out every day. So today I was a little pressed for time, so it was a 20-minute workout, but it's still a 20-minute workout.
Yeah, yeah. When you said health plan, I automatically went to, insurance, benefits, this kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that's probably not what he means. So because I had the question, I wanted to make sure that I went back and asked. So when you became aware of this and you started, you mentioned reading books and looking for other resources, what was the jumping off point? Who did you connect with? Like maybe what book do you remember, or books do you remember starting you off, people that you were following?
Well, I followed all of the normal ones like Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, a lot of Brian Tracy stuff, even some Anthony Robbins. I read all of that. One of them I like that not everybody might be familiar with is Adversity Quotient. Was a book that I really enjoyed. Yeah, and it was, and that got me thinking. See, I also had success without IQ, so I don't think I'm the smartest guy in the room. And so then I was thinking, okay, it has to do with EQ. Okay, so it's managing people and stuff like that. But then I soon started saying it's probably some AQ. How do you deal with adversity? And one of my things I always say is fail often, fail fast, fail cheap. So I had a lot of failures, and other things I would say is having a failure does not make you a failure, and the successful people try. The ones that don't try have no failures. And so I sort of approached life like that.
I hope if you're listening, you're paying attention here, because Jim, what you did is you just gave an enormous amount of wisdom in about a 1-minute stretch. Let me unpack a little bit of that with you. Adversity quotient, in your own words, how would you describe that?
Well, in its simplest form is you will have adversities, and it's the people that are successful are the people that pick themselves up faster. So you get kicked off the horse, how fast do you get back, and how do you let it impact you long term? So you don't become your failure. It's all about how you thrive despite failures, despite adversity, which often the world throws at you. It throws adversity at you.
And in terms of adversity, it's been a while since I went through that work, Adversity Quotient. Stoltz, I can't even remember his first name. Can you help me with that?
I don't recall.
If you look up Stoll's Adversity
Yeah.
Quotient, you'll find it if you're interested in this. But I remember thinking of going into that as adversities, as the major calamities that we face. Choose your own adventure, a job loss, a relationship failing, you lose a loved one. But the adversity quotient, does it not talk about all of those, the amount of adversities that we face on average during the course of it, just those number of times that we're forced into a spot, just by the natural flow of life, of kind of that vibrational shimmer of discomfort that we're then forced with a choice in terms of how we want to meet it. But not so much the big infrastructure changes, but how much adversity we face on any given day. Am I summing that up even close to?
Yeah, part of it also is we might not necessarily be able to change the circumstance, but we can change how we react to the circumstance.
Right.
So it's choosing your reaction to the circumstance, because many of the circumstances are truly horrific, truly horrendous. My brother died. I mean, that's horrendous. It's awful.
Yeah.
But it's how you choose to appropriately grieve and move on and honor his memory, not just live in it and make it who I was.
You also mentioned EQ.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, EQ is the ability to get along with people. And in business, I believe a lot of EQ is how to inspire people. So, I still study how do you inspire people, and I don't fully know everything on how to inspire people. Mm-hmm. But I think that good leaders inspire and inspire appropriate action. So it's how you get along with people, which has been proven to be more part of your success than even your IQ, the intellectual quotient.
Let's go back before even all of this. What do you remember interesting you when you were younger? Like well before you started that first business, and just, when we're kids and we have a certain view of the world and how it works and what our place might be in it, what were some of the things that held your attention at that time?
Well, of course, I was very idealistic, so I was going to save the world. And, when I grew up, there certainly was not going to be any wars or starving people. But I also...
Why were you like that? Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to stop you. Where do you think that came from?
I think that actually comes from a relatively high empathy for other people. So I have a high empathy, and in a sense, that also can create stress, because it does cause stress. Because I am helping a few people, but I'm not helping everyone, and it's stressful. I mean, I have over 1,000 emails from people who want help that I can't help, and so you're limiting who you can help in order that you help those that you can help them well, yeah. And so to some extent, I'm playing God. Now, at the same time, I've got that theme running through me. I did have an entrepreneurial bent from very, very early on. So it was just part of my DNA, and I do not know why that is, but it was part of it. So I had my first bigger business. It wasn't real big. Was painting houses in the place I grew up in, Woodstock. So I hired my brothers. I hired my friends. I had probably 20 employees working for me when I was in high school, painting houses. And to this day, I hate painting.
See, and back you up for a bit, because you've talked about being idealistic, wanting to save the world, wanting to help people. I'll just be transparent, Jim. I don't remember feeling like that when I was younger. I got along with everybody, but I was interested in the things that I wanted to do. I fell into business and entrepreneurial instincts almost by accident much later as my career had carried me along. So I'm trying to get at, and maybe it's pointless to try to figure it out. You are who you are. I'm just genuinely curious of maybe where that came from, that empathy, that curiosity, that entrepreneurial instinct. Did it run in your family to some extent?
Well, my parents would have been very helping people, and my parents were Depression era, so they believed that we had no money and we were going to starve any day now, and they believed in helping people, and so I got that. But my mother was a stay-home mom for until I was quite old, and my father worked for a company, so that would not be entrepreneurial by most. It's the entrepreneurship does not run in the family, but I was not discouraged. Although when I told my mother I was going into business, she cried because she thought I should get a job. And even a few years after I was in my business running it, I remember coming home once for dinner, and she said, "So Jim, have you got a job yet?" And of course, at that time, I was working 80 hours a week in my own business, which I kind of considered to be a job. But
yeah, a couple times over. Let's talk about the house painting for a moment.
Yeah,
how did that even come about?
Well, my father wanted me to paint a fence, and so he showed me how to scrape it and paint it, sand it, prepare it. And I was painting the fence, and one of the neighbors said, "Oh, can you come paint mine?" And so I did that, and then I figured, and he paid me, and I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. And so then I went and I started just knocking on doors, and I'd say, "Oh, I need to see you have that you need your house painted."
I see that your house looks terrible.
Exactly. And
you didn't have a public relations department at that
No,
time.
and I made a little sheet up that said Jim's painting, and I would do the quote right on the spot. I'd look at the house, and I said, "Oh, we'll paint your house for $600. And
how did you know your numbers at that time?
I guessed. I said, "Well, it's probably going to take 8 hours to do this and 4 hours to do that." And paint, I knew how much paint cost and what the coverage of paint was. And I will say some of my first quotes were tremendously underquoted. Like I'd quote $600 and make 40 cents an hour. And but I learned over time, no, this is going to take me longer now. I'm going to end up with some challenges in this. And so I learned.
Did you say you had 20 people working for you at one point?
Yeah, when I was in high school.
Tell me more about that. The first few interactions of little Jim running around and thinking, okay, I need to do some delegation here because I've got more work than can come in. How do you approach people as a high school student? You said, right?
Yeah.
So do you want to come work? Tell me more about that.
Well, I had 3 brothers, so I hired 2 of them. My youngest brother was too young to help, but I hired my 2 brothers to work for me, and then I hired some friends. So I just hired friends, and friends, needed to make some money, wanted to make some money, and I kind of had my own little standards and my own little way of training people that what they had to do. Like you always had to have a rag in your back pocket in case you drip something, you can wipe it up, and you always had to have a garbage bag on site because we cleaned up the people's hedges and garbage around, and that actually was a competitive advantage because we were polite. You go in someone's house, you always take your shoes off. Little things. It wasn't a written down manual, but it was the way it was, and so people like doing business with us. Again,
I'm curious about where that inherent, you call it the golden rule or common courtesy. You're the CEO of a large business. You know firsthand it seems really fundamental, but it's often not in business, and you seem to have that inherently.
And it certainly wasn't in the painting business in Woodstock. The painters in Woodstock were complete pigs, many of them. I mean, they'd throw their cigarette butts on someone's lawn, and it was just the way they were, partly because there was a lot of there wasn't as much competition as you would think for the jobs. So the politeness could be my little edge as a kid, because I was young, I looked young, and you'd trust me to paint your house. Like, that's a little bit of trust, I think.
Let's fast forward a little bit and into that business that we mentioned earlier that you, quote, started out of the trunk of your car in university. Tell me about that.
So I was a systems design engineering student, and I was just graduating, and I needed a computer, and because I wanted to do some circuit board design, and that was what I thought I would do, is be a circuit board designer. And I thought I would do that sort of on contract. I'll do one circuit for you and board for you and one circuit board for someone else. So I was going to be sort of like a Kelly Services of engineering outsource.
Gotcha.
And but I needed a computer, and I got a better deal if I bought 2 of them. So I bought 2 and I sold one, and then someone else wanted one, so I bought another 2, and then someone wanted a printer, and someone wanted a monitor, and someone wanted some software. So I'm buying and selling stuff, and that was before the days of computer stores, and then computer stores started to come out, and I was going to open a computer store, and I applied for an IBM dealership, and IBM turned me down, so I started selling to all of the other dealers, and I became a wholesaler. And so it was, at the time I thought, oh, I failed, isn't it awful? But it turned out made my business, because all these computer stores needed wholesalers to buy from. And I designed some stuff as well. So I had a small engineering team, and we did a character generator to generate French characters on a screen at that time. That was revolutionary for the Canadian government, who needed French characters on a screen, and we did the same thing with Greek letters, which we applied to APL, which is a programming language that's used in statistics in universities. And so we had a few proprietary design products that we did.
I'd like to paint a little bit more of this picture to give people some context. What time frame was this?
So I started the business in 1979, so 1980. So it was prior to the IBM PC. So now that makes me sound old. I am old.
Well, but that's part of what, when you say computer, we've got generations of people now that don't know anything but the convenience of these kinds of tools. But I'm a little bit younger than you. I was born in 1974, but I remember my dad assembling a computer whose memory was held on a cassette tape.
That's right.
I mean, it's almost impossible to think about now. So we're well pre-internet. We're even pre where you would rent a VCR along with the tapes to be able to watch a film. And you had the foresight long before it was commonplace for people to have what I'll call personal computers, to see the opportunity of what was available at the time.
So you could say I had the foresight, or I had the luck.
Okay.
So I just happened to like and love computers, and so I was building computers and parts and stuff. And so I just happened to go to the user groups of the computer nerds, and I was an engineer, and I lucked into it. So the electronics and was my interest and passion, and I just turned that into a business. But it was largely a reselling business. So I was just buying and reselling memory and disk drives and peripherals. Everything.
So essentially not all that different than the model that you were using with painting.
No, not a lot differently.
You're just reselling a product instead of a service.
Yeah, I guess the only difference would be I'd say the technology was more of a passion. So I actually, as a good time, would go to a trade show. I was my spare time, I'd read Byte magazine, because that would be interesting.
Right.
My hobby would be to build a little circuit to turn your lights on and off, or just little projects was sort of my hobby. Painting was never my hobby. Painting was a way to create a job for myself and make some money, and it just got out of control and it grew.
When did you stop the painting?
Well, I didn't. I never really shut the business down. I sold most of the ladders and the scaffolding when I went to university, but then I kept painting houses all the way through university into my first couple of years of my business on my off hours and on my weekends, because I was starting. You're a business. I had no funding, so you're not making anything, or you're making very little money, and painting houses was sure money. So I'd quote you, $1,000 to paint your house, and I know I get $1,000, where the electronics business was not sure thing. So I did that for a couple of years as a way to make a few dollars, and all the way through university, I would always have paint an apartment or a house here or there, and whatnot. And I did keep some of my equipment, the lights mostly, and stuff. I didn't keep my scaffolding though.
You just refused to go and get a job, huh, Jim?
That's right. That's right. Well, I had lots of jobs during that time too, but
well, I'm laughing about that because I recognize that language as somebody who really respects and relates to entrepreneurs and business people. And I'm really appreciative that you have given me a bit of an idea of how the concepts of personal growth interrelate with business growth, because I talk to or just business in general. Because it's my feeling, Jim, that people that embark upon their own business or follow that entrepreneurial spirit are very much like I'll call it relatively small, in my view, percentage of the population of people that really embark upon that journey of personal growth and exploration and understanding. And you mentioned about values. I know for myself, I didn't even know. I thought, what does that mean? Like, okay, I'm a good person, but what are my values? To understand what that is. I think it's the ultimate accountability play, that when you take complete responsibility over your own experience. It's why I'm laughing about when are you going to get a job, but you're working 80 hours a week. You've got all these other people that are relying on you to continue to go and create work, and all of the other economies that you're serving in your own way by buying all those products, by servicing everything it needs to take the business or to keep it going. That there's a responsibility there that I think just about anyone would benefit from if they could walk a little way in those shoes just to see what it's like. Even if you're just going to go back to being an employee, not that I'm talking down on having a job or being an employee, but if you knew what it was like to take total responsibility over your experience, how do you think that might change things in our culture?
Well, it changes it to the better and it changes it to the worst. I will tell you, if you work for yourself, you will work harder and longer than if you work for someone else, generally. That's been my experience. But as far as self-discovery goes, the more you know yourself, the more successful you will be. And partly that's because you will do more things that are aligned with your values. And when you do things that are aligned with your values, you get into a non-stress flow situation, and that's your most powerful state. Also, the more you know yourself, the more you will do things that you uniquely are capable of doing. And the more you know and you do your things that are your unique ability, that's where you have huge impact. Like, you're a smart guy. I'm sure you can do. I'm a smart guy. I could do accounting, but it's not my best use of time for me. Now, a smart accountant, they could be their best use of time, and they might love it. I struggle, and I can muscle my way through it, but I don't love it, and I'm not great at it. And but I might be better at some product visioning, or some creative marketing, or some business structuring, some that sort of thing. I'm better at.
What's a time that comes to mind that you had to make a decision that on the surface might have seemed like a difficult decision, but you were able to make pretty clearly because of measuring what to do or not do against your values?
I don't know if this is right on the values thing, but I do remember driving home from work one day, and I was just dead tired and swamped and feeling behind. I had about 20 employees working for me, and I was the only person with a key to the business because I had trust issues. And I just decided at that point, I can't scale this business if I'm the only one with a key. So the next day I went out and I actually made 20 keys and showed everybody how to use the alarm system, and decided I didn't need to be the first one in, the last one out. And I'm not sure how that totally is within the values part of the question, but it was a pivotal time. And ever since then, I've looked at scalability. So what can I do to scale what I do, not just do it on a small scale?
I think what you're talking about there shows a high degree of self-awareness, though, doesn't it?
It took me a while to be that self-aware. It took me being dead tired after being the first one in, the last one out for the first few years.
See, but here's another parallel to the personal and professional world, I think. To say that you have trust issues, and I think, Jim, we've all got a choice of whether we want our hearts to be opened or whether we want to keep them closed because we're afraid of being hurt or taken advantage of.
Well, but another way I could word it is I have micromanagement issues.
Okay.
So that also ties. But then if you realize that micromanagement creates a lack of scalability. Yeah. And if I have to make all the decisions. So I have another philosophy, and that is the bigger the company, the more your job is to coach on culture and let other people make decisions. So a company like Danby Appliances, if I made all the decisions, the company would be fundamentally self-limited. I need to coach on culture and have the right culture so that people can make decisions whether or not I am making the decisions.
What happened after you handed out those 20 keys?
Well, after we handed out those 20 keys, eventually we had hundreds of employees, and it grew. And but for me, it was sort of it was symbolic that I couldn't. I was a one-person company with 20 employees, and you can't be and there are many one-person companies that have 20 employees. But it was my opening up to growing the business. So we grew a lot in the next few years. And as I was studying myself, I would learn what I was good at and do it, and learn what I wasn't good at and let other people do that. And I would hire people to do the good jobs I was not good at or didn't love doing.
Have you ever, in your travels of consuming different books and courses and things like that, have you come across Bob Proctor? Do you know much about his story?
Sure. Yeah.
Because I'm hearing a lot of his story and what you're saying of when he talked about how he didn't have a lot of knowledge of what to do, but then he started doing things in a certain way. Of course, he's, big with the Napoleon Hill book, but cleaning the floors and how quickly things escalated. And so it almost sounds like you'd run up against, through your cultivation of your self-awareness, both what you were good at and areas that may have been holding you back. Then you maybe sort of step into that anxiety a little bit, and a whole other level opens itself up to you with the growth of the business until you sort of reach that, maybe that next, I'm going to have to hand out the keys type moment. Is that a process that just has continued as you've gone from business to business?
It absolutely is a continuing process. And the other thing I did when I was scaling my business, when I was doing 50 million in sales, I said, okay, what do I have to be to do 100 million? And then when I was doing 100 million, what do I have to do? What different do I have to do 200 million and 500 million and $1 billion and $2 billion? So I always would study and say, okay, so if I'm running a $2 billion company, what am I going to have to be to do that? And often I'd end up giving up my pet projects because that doesn't move the needle to the extent I need to move the needle, or I'm not uniquely good at it. And although I kept some things just because I didn't mind doing them, I enjoyed it. But that's also a good recognition in self. If you say, "Oh, I like doing this," that's a fine reason to do it. There's nothing wrong with that. But as far as the impact on the business, sometimes it's not the biggest impact.
What business were you primarily a part of at the time when you reached that point in your 30s, where you just felt, gosh, this is taking too much out of me. I'm going to have to make some changes to sustain this over the long haul.
So that was my computer distribution business.
Okay.
So that was I did that for 25 years. So that was my business. I was doing that. And so I hit many of those inflection points of figuring out, how do I give things up in order to grow? And that really is the fundamental of growth, is giving things up in a business. Even if you take Danby appliances, I can't grow if I sell everything. So great, you want a freezer. It's great that you want a freezer. I could sell you a freezer, but that's not very scalable, because you're not buying a container of freezers. You're not buying 10 containers a week of freezers. So it's best for me to have someone else know more about the products and be able to sell you one freezer.
Who did you reach out to at that time? I mean, on a more personal level, other maybe friends or mentors that you could go to as you were working through each of these challenges to talk to and ask advice from?
So one of my early mentors, and I never called him a mentor, he never knew he was a mentor, is the former owner of Danby, John Wood, who owned Wood's Freezers and Danby. And at the time they had 1,200 employees, and I was just a kid, probably, 30, 40 employees, and I would met with him occasionally, and he would give me some wise counsel. Another person who was on my board for 10 years was Frank Hasenfratz, who owned and started Linamar Machines. And Linamar right now does, I think, $10 billion in sales, has 10 or 12,000 employees. And he had started that business from essentially the trunk of his car. And the other part of the circle, which is interesting, is he worked when he came to Canada for Wood's Freezers or Danby. So it's a really it's a circle. It's really interesting because he worked making freezer parts, freezers, and he said, "How much do you pay for that part?" And they said, "Oh, we pay $5." He said, "Well, how many did you buy?" 100,000. Well, if I could supply it for $4, would you buy it? And they said yes. And so he went and bought a machine and set it up in his garage, and he became a $0 to $10 billion man. And he's still a very, very good friend. I play bridge with him, and very wise counsel guy.
For the sake of time, I'm going to ask you a somewhat unfair question, because we're going to do sort of a DeLorean-type leap over the timeline here. But because you've mentioned one tie to where you are now here at Danby, how did things evolve and unfold to lead you to this role?
So I've had a lot of luck in my life, and so I retired from my $2 billion business. I moved to New York and did angel capital for almost 5 years. And my dad got sick, and he lived in Guelph, so I moved back to Guelph, and I happened to have been sitting on the board of Danby Appliances at that time. The CEO resigned, and I said, okay, I'll come in and do interim CEO role. And my father had passed by then, and then I was doing that for a couple of years, and the Wood family said, we'd like you to sell the business. And I said, how much for? And I said, they told me, and I said, great, I'll take it. So I bought the business after I'd been running it for a couple of years, which is the best way to buy a business, because I knew where all the snakes were, and the due diligence was really, I mean, I had 2 years of due diligence. It was low risk for me and low risk for them, and lower cost on legals, and everything worked well.
So you've been in the position of both the seller and the buyer in terms of a large business. Let's talk about the first one first, and that business that you built up initially. If I read it right, you sold that and then continued to act as the CEO.
Yeah,
is that correct?
Yeah, so I was CEO there for 5 years, and we ran it from $800 million to $2 billion. So that was my bigger company, but I was an employee at that time. But I was running the business, and Cynics was a great company, and they allowed me to run the business, but I had to study how to get them to let me run the business.
I wish you could see Jim's eyes here right now. They sort of snuck up a little bit further under your eyebrows. Anyway, please continue.
So early after I'd sold my business, I wasn't having a lot of fun, and I confided in one of my friends I wasn't having a lot of fun, and he said, well, the problem is you're not selling to head office. And that changed my view. See, before, when you're running your own business, working for yourself, I'd say, I want to buy a new building, and then I'd buy a new building. When I had sold the business, I said, I want to buy a new building, and California said, no, you can't buy a building. But as soon as I approached it, and I'd get depressed, I'd say, what do you mean? It's good for the company. We need to do it. It's a great deal, blah, blah, blah. And but when I approached it as a sale, I didn't get depressed, because I've lost so many sales in my life that I don't get depressed if someone doesn't buy from me. I just figure, okay, great, you didn't buy your freezer from me. How do I sell you now? Okay, I need to talk to your wife. What do I need to do? I always, take the kicks in the shin and come back. And so I developed a deliberate plan. That's when I started my blog, because the head office had mentioned at one of the meetings, blogs had just started to come out. And someone said, oh, tell me about what these blogs are about. So I started one of the first blogs, and started blogging, and I kept at it. And then I also had a problem, because I was running a company that had bought mine in Canada, and I had a lot of employees who didn't start with me. My staff had been with me, from day one, and many of them had been with me for 20 years. And so there's cultural things. So I used the blog as a subtle way to share my philosophies and personalize myself. So it served a double duty.
When was this?
That would have been probably 1994.
So it was early blogging.
Oh, it was very early blogging. It was one of the first blogs out there. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you use the compound effect.
Right.
I just keep doing it, but that's another rabbit hole that we could go down. I was going to ask what it's like to sell a business that you've built. You've somewhat answered that already by describing some of what happened after, but if you have other thoughts to share on that, please do. But then I'll also tag on to the end of how you knew ultimately when it was time to move on from that entity altogether, even after it had been sold, and you acted in the role that you just mentioned.
So part of the reason I sold my business was fear, because when you're an entrepreneur, you're always worried that, what's going to happen the next year, the next 5 years? And I believed in sort of selling while I was doing well. So I was doing well. My sales were up every year. My profits were, I had 99 consecutive quarters of profit, which was a good streak. But I was always worried the streak might end. So it was sort of sold out of fear. And it was also sold out of giving me options. There's another older guy in our computer business that I went to visit once, and he looked like he was on his deathbed, but he couldn't leave his business because that was his baby and he owned the whole thing. And I said, I don't want to be that. So it gave me options. But then when I got into doing the angel capital, which I'd done quite a bit of before while I was doing my business, I realized it's not as fulfilling to just be a board member or advisor, because sometimes they don't take my advice, and sometimes there's something good about running a business. That's why when the opportunity to run Danby came up, I said, yeah, I'd love to run Danby again. So I like having a business. It gives me the platform, and it gives me it allows me to work within my greatest competitive advantage. So I quite enjoy running a business.
For somebody that doesn't have an idea of what Danby Appliances is, can you give me the 5-cent tour?
Sure. We're a manufacturer of household appliances. We actually make small, large appliances. So when I say small appliances, that would be bar fridges, freezers, microwaves. We do sell air conditioners, which say, how does that fit with an appliance company? The common theme is they have compressors. We sell dehumidifiers. We sell wine coolers. So most of it's around refrigeration. And we do have a few tabletop appliances. We don't actually make them, or we just put our label on tabletop appliance. But most of our business is smaller, large appliances that you see in hotels, for instance. And it's your second appliance, the leader in second appliances.
What is it about this business that intrigues you to have taken over to the extent that you have?
Well, it wasn't actually that I am in love with appliance business. I think I'm more in love with running a business. So I like the fact that it's about a $400 million company, so it's got people, it's got scale. If you run a $400 million company, you can save 1% on expenses, that's $4 million. You make 1% more gross margin, that's $4 million. You sell 10% more, that's $40 million. You don't get that scalability in early and startup businesses.
I had a question in my mind, and then I let it slip while I was listening to you. Part of it was the other, Cinex, the sales went up to $2 billion, I think you said?
Yeah.
So not to say that this is a step down. Here's what the question was. Regardless of which kind of example you care to use, whether it's a $400 million business, a $2 billion business, doesn't really matter all that much. But in terms of something that does have that much scale, that many working parts and pieces, and people and things for whom and for which you are ultimately responsible, what's that like?
Well, if I didn't want to do it, I wouldn't do it. I actually love it. And to some extent, I am good at complexity. So when you have a scale, you have a certain complexity, and I'm good at it. It's within my core competency. So I'm well versed to do this. What I like about a $400 million company, that's perfectly within my scope, because I was doing $2 billion, now doing $400 million. I can turn this into the $1 billion company over the next decade. It works well within my competency.
What are the differences?
The differences are actually not huge between a company with only 50 employees and 500 or 1,000 employees, in my experience, because when you have 50 employees, you're only dealing with a limited number of people. You have 500 employees or 1,000 employees, you're only dealing with a limited number of people. So the difference is just the numbers tend to get bigger. I guess with every new person, you have one more possible problem. But I mean, one of the challenges you have when you sell 2 million appliances, and we're a consumer brand, 2 million appliances, even if you have 0.01% have any issue, that's a lot of volume of calls and emails. But I love it.
We've talked about some numbers here in the last couple of minutes, but let's talk about people. And going back to where we started, and you talked about wanting to help and the empathy and I'm thinking about time I've spent on the Danby website where it's in a number of different very prominent places that says very clearly either we want to help or we like to help, something of that. But that helping nature. What is it that about being here gives you the opportunity to help the people that ultimately want to achieve some of these goals that you've articulated through some of the numbers and the scale that you've talked about?
So when I believe that working and work ethic is a core value, it's one of my core values, and it's something that if you give people an opportunity to work, that is good. And one of the things I like about having a business with scale is I can give a lot of people an opportunity to work. What you're talking about on the company tagline is do the right thing. And do the right thing is a great way to scale a business, because you can't possibly have a manual that tells you how to do everything in every circumstance. And by saying do the right thing, people can just do the right thing. How do you treat your coworker? Well, you do the right thing. How do you treat your customer? Do the right thing. How do you treat your suppliers? Do the right thing. That actually creates scalability in a business. And because I had said that 10,000 times, it was tough when you see a crisis going on in the world to not just stand by and say, well, I'm not going to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing. It's just who you are.
Well, that brings us closer to home in terms of where you have been recently. I'll maybe let you tell the story about seeing something going on in the world and you telling yourself, this isn't really a choice. I need to do the right thing. So what was it and what did you do?
Well, I could see what was going on in Syria and the refugee crisis, and it was bothering me, and so I said, what can I do? What's my small piece? So I decided to sponsor 50 Syrian refugee families, and so far we've actually brought in 58 families, and we're actually going to be bringing in more. But to bring in 50 families, I thought of it like a business. How do you scale? Because I can't meet 50 families at the airport and set up 50 family households and set up, help them set up their bank accounts and health card and all of that kind of stuff. So I set it up like a business. I have a director of jobs, a director of health, a director of education, and director of mentorship. And every family that comes in, we had an Arabic-speaking mentor family and 4 or 5 English-speaking mentor families, and we have checklists to get the bank account, get the health card, get the library card, get the bus pass, ride the bus with them, and we have scorecards to say how are they doing. Oh, they need a ESL tutor. They need, what do people need? The other key on this project is to help people get through a hard time, not to try to permanently help people. It's to help people help themselves. That's all you're trying to do. And you also have to think of it as, can you imagine if someone came and took all of your stuff, moved you to another country where you don't speak the language and your credentials are not recognized and you don't have a Rolodex? You just need someone to help you get started. But once you get started, you're willing to work hard, you'll become your own success.
How does one even begin to identify and connect with the process, Jim, of trying to get them over here and empower them?
So we started by sponsoring families of families who were here. So some people had relatives, so they knew people. And then the government also had pre-security cleared. So they would send the list out every week, and you'd take a look at the list and say, great, we'd take this family and that family. I will also say it doesn't take much to get 50 families. Like, as I said, we're at 58 families, and that's a tip of the iceberg, and it feels bad not to do more. But it's sort of like if you are a dog person, you go to the Humane Society, and they say, okay, we're going to destroy all these dogs tonight. Well, what do? Can you take 50 dogs, or can you take 2, or what can you do, right? It's tough.
When you say sponsor a family, what more specifically does that mean?
Well, when you do private sponsorship in Canada, you've agreed to take financial obligation for the first year. And you've also agreed to do certain settlement things. So that's all of the moving them into an apartment and getting them all their stuff that they need. So there's a financial obligation. You're basically guaranteeing to the government that people don't go on social assistance for the first year. So refugees are not eligible to get welfare. And in the event they did go to get welfare, then the government would pull my bond and take it out of me anyways.
How fair is it to say that there's an element of risk in some sense to do something like that?
And in what respect? You're talking terrorism?
I'm being deliberately vague. What you mentioned about, the government might pull my bond, or just, I don't know, running up against that next challenge that you weren't necessarily expecting. Or I've read where you've said that the things that were the biggest challenges turned out to be the ones that you couldn't see ahead of time.
Oh, yeah.
Hold a different view over what you should or shouldn't be doing.
Well, you definitely you have to. It's like a business. You have to pivot. So as we're getting people in, you have to go, oh, this isn't a big deal. This is a big deal. So I learned that you can't learn English in a year. I learned I learned that people I couldn't easily put them in your business to work. They had to work for someone for a few months just to get the Canadian way of doing things. And as far as the people that say that we should not bring anybody in, I get a little bit of that backlash, but that's just part of life. And I actually think as entrepreneurs, you're fairly used to doing things that people don't necessarily agree with. I mean, if you look at society is 99.9% people that work and say, you should get a job. And it's the entrepreneurs who go out and do things that people say, gee, you shouldn't, why don't you play it safe and get a job at a bank, right? That's the safer way to do it.
Did your mom ever stop asking if you were going to get a job?
Well, eventually she did see some success, so she hasn't asked me any more lately.
She's still with you?
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Yeah.
And I guess if she has any issue, she would think, well, why don't you just retire? But but again, that's her background of, play it safe and do it.
What's it like for you when you see yourself and the people that you're working with run up against these unforeseen challenges, but then somehow figure out a way around or through them?
Well, it's a roller coaster, and of course it's very gratifying when people come through and people succeed, but it's a process. And this process will actually be a decade, will be how we will measure success in a project like this. There's a lot of little good things that happen that are really, really great, though. I have gazillions of stories of warm parts of having the refugees.
What are, just maybe before we wrap up, a couple examples of things maybe that you've benefited from or even learned about yourself through it?
I guess one of the things I was always grateful, and I always kept a grateful gratitude log, but it makes me more grateful to realize the little things that we take for granted. I'd visit my refugee families, and they always serve tea. So I've drank way more tea than I've ever drunk in my life, and I like it. But one of them served baklava, and he said to me, in Lebanon, we had no baklava. And I said, well, what do you mean, Lebanon? There's got to be lots of baklava. And he said, we couldn't afford it. And so he is feeling blessed that he can have baklava. And for me, it just makes me realize that the things we take for granted, our safety and security, and if anything, it's not that I'm going to go home hungry tonight. It's going to be that I eat too much. That's my challenge.
Which is why the health plan has to kick in.
Which is why the health plan has to kick in. So it's that I'm going to eat too much baklava.
What comes to mind when I ask you what some of those families have told you their experience, other than the baklava and what, but just trying to learn a new language, get used to a completely new culture? What are some of the things that they've shared with you that it's been like for them?
Well, of course, I've had the stories of massive destruction and bombing, and people have showed me pictures of their houses, and you say, oh, that's who owns the Mercedes in the driveway? Oh, that was my Mercedes. And you look at the house, and then you see the same house that's basically a shell, bombed, burned. So you've got that part of the sadness. When people arrive, they're happy because they're safe. And then they start to get more and more depressed because they say, well, I was a lawyer and I can't practice law. Nobody respects me here. And then they turn at some point and say, "Oh, I can make a new life." So as soon as you come to the realization that you can make a new life for yourself, then you start getting more and more optimistic and start saying, "Oh yeah, I can still make a living here and I can still do well." And many of them have also had their sense of gratitude is high, and their sense of what they might not have. And because most of them had been out of Syria for a few years, often living in quite austere, like if you live in Turkey, you're not allowed to work, for instance, and so you're barely able to afford to eat. That's your life is trying to do really, really basic support yourself.
That gives some really good context, I think, for the reality. The word refugee is, searching for the right vocabulary, Jim, I was going to say dangerously vague.
Well, the difference between a refugee and an immigrant is immigrants come here voluntarily and want to do it. Refugees really don't have a choice because of their situation in their home country. They no longer have a safe home country or a country that can look after them. That's really what the difference is between a refugee and an immigrant.
Yeah, if you put yourself into the position of thinking of having been in a certain place and of a certain culture and built a very successful and maybe happy life, and through circumstances completely beyond any control of yours, all of a sudden it's gone.
That's
snuffed
exactly
out,
what it is.
and you've got nowhere to turn. And maybe this is just my own personal prejudice, for want of a better word, coming up, but I think that there are some words that we look at maybe as casually without necessarily thinking about the humanity. And now we're back to where we started again, of that humanitarian idea of what that could really mean.
Right. I mean, often people think of refugees as homeless people.
This is what I'm getting at.
Who, and many homeless people have mental health issues. And to some extent, many of them are self-inflicted mental health issues. So they have drug problems, alcohol problems, and that is not these people. These people had life, they had businesses, and they were living very similar lives to you and I. Syria was a very developed country. Syria, people would go to vacation there on the beaches. Like, it was a very advanced. The buildings, they had skyscrapers, they had everything, and all of a sudden, you take a suitcase, and that's what you arrive with, and you don't speak the language, and your credentials aren't recognized. You have no Rolodex, and it's cold by your standards, and you don't fully understand what's going on. It takes. I find that the refugees that succeed have to sort of give up be willing to accept that there is a safety net and they're going to make their own life, and that's something that we never have had to do. Like it's just different.
Wrapping up, it's funny how fast an hour can go by. I've got so many things that I'd like to ask you, but in terms of being in a business, it sounds to me from everything that you've described that doing that successfully affords you the opportunity to be able to do some things and maybe empower some people that you might not otherwise be able to do if it were just you. You've described, and thank you for sharing about the situation with the people from Syria. You also talked about a goal of getting the company from 400 million to $1 billion. But you also really strike me as a really curious guy who's always looking to figure out the next thing. So I'm curious, before I let you go, of what comes to mind of other things that are maybe out there for you, that whether it's directly related to the business here at Danby or just things that are rattling around between Jim's ears that you're curious about that you'd like to try to figure out at some point. What comes to mind?
Well, I think another one of the huge global issues is climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been an environmentalist for a long, long time. I had one of the first solar panels in my roof, and I drive a Prius, and I started a recycling program at the University of Waterloo when I was there. But so I think the environment is a huge, huge challenge. On the humanitarian front, part of the problem is we're bandaging up the wounded. We have to figure out how not to have the wounded. And from a wealth point of view, I believe that wealthy people often end up with psychological problems, that wealthy people feel they need more money. So I have friends that have $1 billion that need to make more money, but they can only eat as much as I can, and they can only consume so much. So why do you need more money at a certain point? So the best, healthiest thing that you can do is figure out what's your number for my lifestyle. That's what I do, and everything above that, my job is to give that away, and try to do the most good I can with that money. But of course, you grow a business, you need money for to grow a business. That's a fine thing, but I tend to be a non-consumer.
You've given me a lot to think about, Jim, and I hope that anybody that's taken the time to listen will consider what you've said and maybe go back and listen to it more than once, because there's a lot to think about in there, and I can think of several other conversations that I'd love to have with you, but who knows, maybe we'll get to do that down the road. But thank you for inviting me in here today. It really is a pleasure to meet you, and I'm really grateful for this time. Thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
To learn more about Jim, you can follow his posts on LinkedIn or Facebook. His last name is Estill, E-S-T-I-L-L. Jim Estill, E-S-T-I-L-L. And if you'd like to learn more about Danby appliances, you can find them online at www.danby.com. I'll spell that name for you. D-A-N-B-Y. D-A-N-B-Y. Danby.com. If you like this episode, I'm pretty sure you're going to like episode 10. That's with David Cicerelli, the CEO and co-founder of Voices.com, a terrific story of building a business there. Episode 50 is with Jim Gilbert, how I got so huggable, of starting from basically a gas station with one used car to sell to becoming Canada's huggable car dealer. A remarkable business building and humanitarian story there. And episode 58, a recent one with John Davidson, the story of Jesse's journey. I thought I would mention that simply because the compassion and the kindness and the warmth and the genuine humanness that I got from Jim Estill reminded me a lot of John Davidson. That's a terrific story as well. It's episode 58. You can find those and all the archived episodes of Journeys with the No Schedule Man on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, and at noschedulemanpodcast.com. I believe we're also on Google Music in the United States as well. If you'd like to use that, have a look for the show there. If you'd like to connect with me, I'd really love to hear from you. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. My handle is the same on every single one of those platforms, at NoScheduleMan, or just whatever social platform.com/NoScheduleMan. Fire me a note. I'd love to hear from you and to say hi. Keep in mind, I put out a short video blog each week. It's called Footsteps, and you can find it on my YouTube channel. I also post those videos on the Facebook page at facebook.com/NoScheduleMan. If you'd like to work with me personally, there are a few ways that we can do that. You can learn more about my speaking, workshops, seminars, or one-on-one or group coaching opportunities. All of that information is available on my website at kevinbulmer.com. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and share, and I do hope to have you here again next week as we all grow together and explore another story on Journeys with the No Schedule Man.
Just a little deja vu.